cell phone clutched in one hand and a rolled-up newspaper in the other gave him the look of a stereotypical Wall Street junkie. He barked an address at the cab driver. The driver rolled his eyes in response to his new passenger's attitude. Having just returned from New York that morning in time for a business lunch, Greg was still in his East Coast mode and very late to meet his girlfriend at their apartment. Block after block, the San Diego native chatted endlessly into his phone, pausing only long enough to dial a new number or switch to an incoming call. How about some good news for a change, he thought to himself, frustrated by the messages left for him. Suddenly, and unexpectedly, there was a pause.
Hey, wait a second,
Greg said to his counterpart through the receiver.
This isn't my jacket. That idiot at the restaurant gave me the wrong one.
Overhearing this remark, the driver looked into the rearview mirror and asked, "You want me to go back to where I picked you up?" Running his hand over the lapel, Greg looked at the designer label on the inside and smiled. The tone of superiority returned to his voice as he said,
No way, this one's much better than mine. Some sucker will be stuck with my old jacket.
He enjoyed the thought of the other man fuming when he discovered the switch with an inferior garment. The driver shook his head in disappointment before catching himself. Sadly, he had accurately assessed his passenger's character. As a virtual poster child for the Me Society, Greg expressed little regard for others and their feelings. He was all about looking good and looking successful, though he hadn't always been that way. In actuality, he ran a small marketing company and was much less impressive than the inflated title he had conjured up for himself on his business card. Far from the successful image he projected, he was seriously in debt and found himself uninspired and unfulfilled. Even worse, his relationship with his girlfriend, Mia, was falling apart, fast. At this moment, his life was reminiscent of a bike ride on flat tires down a dirt road pockmarked with potholes. The one thing he had learned for certain was that nothing in life was certain. There had been a time where everything was laid out before him like a banquet for a conquering hero. He had a plan, a strategy, and was armed with the energy of a nuclear explosion. His entire life was on track, until he ran into what many would consider simple, ordinary roadblocks. This was his Achilles heel. He knew how to dream in grandiose proportions, and he even knew a thing or two about follow-through. He just couldn't seem to handle adversity. And in this deeply troubled economy, there was little else in front of him, as for so many other people. In other words, Greg was full of expectations, but had no result to show for them. In Texas, they refer to it as all hat, no cattle.
Now we're here,
the cabbie announced, pulling up to the curb in front of a luxury apartment building that very few people could afford, especially Greg himself nowadays. Stepping out of the cab and mumbling, "Keep the change," he tossed a wadded-up $20 bill through the window. Looking at the meter and the wrinkled cash, the driver realized he had just been given a whopping 10-cent tip. Another big spender, he thought to himself as he sped off in disgust. "Good evening," Frank the doorman said in advance of Greg's approach. Handing the tenant his mail and a past-due rent notice, Frank leaned toward him and whispered, "Sir, there is something I need to tell you." Greg motioned to the phone still pressed to his ear. He continued talking and walking. Frank, who had worked in the building since it opened, shrugged his shoulders and went back to his duties. Unfortunately, this was not an unusual interaction between the two. The only pause in the telephonic monologue came when the elevator door opened, and then only because Greg knew there would be no reception inside it. He cut the call short. Relieved that no one joined him inside, he pushed the button for his floor and leaned back, mesmerized by his own reflection in the shiny doors. Gazing at himself, he thought, "I look pretty good in my new jacket." It was a quiet ride to his destination, but his brain was less than still. Having no one to talk to, his internal dialogue about his current troubles kept him busy until the ding of the elevator disrupted his reverie. Returning home as he had done 100 times before, he stepped from the elevator, walked to his apartment, unlocked the door, and went inside, calling out his girlfriend's name. "Mia!" The two had been together for 5 years, yet the last 12 months had been tough. All she wanted was the man Greg used to be, and not this image he created for himself. And all he wanted was to avoid commitment at any cost. They had attempted counseling with little success because Greg always seemed to have some crisis come up that preempted their scheduled appointments. Mia knew he wasn't a bad person, yet wondered if he was the right person for her. Walking through the hallway, he noticed something missing. Actually, more than just something was missing. Almost everything was missing. Greg stood there in confusion. This was his apartment, right? He stepped back into the hall and looked at the number on the door. The number was correct. The view of the city was right. Pretty spectacular, in fact, a detail that had upped the price of the apartment substantially. The only problem was that the living room was bare, stripped. There were only empty spaces where the furnishings used to be. He grabbed the telephone and punched the button that connected him directly to the front desk. Frank answered immediately.
Yes, as I tried to tell you when you came in, she left 2 days ago, and she said to tell you, well, I'd rather not say.
Forget it! I get the picture, Greg barked, then dropped the receiver and looked around. He had to admire her well-executed plan. It was almost as if the Grinch had visited a Who house and cleared out the whole place. The only items she had left behind were his favorite, rather lived-in chair and a side table with a single-framed photograph on it. There was a note taped to the photo. He removed it from the frame and read it aloud.
Greg, here is a picture of you in the Bahamas. Notice that you are on the beach alone. This represents the way I felt in our relationship. I hope you find someone who can love you as much as you love yourself. Me.
Throwing the note aside, he felt a sense of abandonment as he trudged across the room, removing the stranger's coat and letting it fall to the bare floor. As he loosened his tie, he noticed that a business card had fallen out of the jacket onto the floor, face up. It hadn't occurred to him to check the pockets to see if he could figure out who the owner might be. He picked up the card. The name printed on the business card was that of the legendary Jonathan Buckland, who just happened to be the most well-known and politically well-connected business tycoon in the city. Greg flipped the card over to look at the back. Nothing. It was blank. He looked at the front again. Could this be Mr. Buckland's jacket? He wondered. Greg smiled as he smelled opportunity. Immediately, his attitude changed from loss to hope. He now had an excuse to call this great man. The chance to connect, even briefly, with a person of Buckland's stature would be worth much more than the value of the jacket that now lay crumpled at Greg's feet. Forgetting all about the empty apartment and the girlfriend who had left him, he went to the telephone to call the business leader's office. Maybe his luck had changed. More gold has been mined from the thoughts of men than has ever been taken from the earth. Napoleon Hill. Chapter 2. Awakening. The lobby of Jonathan Buckland's headquarters building was awe-inspiring, with imported wood floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that made one feel small, even insignificant, a rare feeling for someone as self-important as this visitor. In that moment, Greg remembered the buildings he had visited as a young boy. His father sometimes took him along on business trips into the city. Those adventures with his dad had inspired Greg's dreams of success. He could not stop himself from comparing his boyhood dreams with his currently unfulfilled life. Things sure hadn't worked out as he had planned. It occurred to him that he had not been in touch with his family for a few weeks. Maybe it was a few months. He'd call later, he promised himself, when he had some good news to report. He didn't want them thinking he wasn't rolling in cash. A smiling receptionist greeted him.
Welcome to the World Capitol Building. Please take the elevator to the 54th floor and enjoy your visit.
In the few moments it took to reach his destination, Greg pulled himself together. He put on his best game face and gave himself a quick pep talk. This was his moment to shine. He stood ready to exit the elevator, armed with all the self-generated confidence and charisma he could muster. When the doors parted, the eager guest burst out with the force of a rodeo bull jumping out of the gates. "Watch out there, Pops," he said as he pushed past a tall, older gentleman who stood before him, presumably waiting to enter the elevator. Marching toward the reception desk, he held up a Neiman Marcus bag with a borrowed jacket inside and announced,
"Hey there, I'm here to meet Mr. B. I have something for him."
"Yes, he was expecting you,"
the receptionist began. Greg cut her off by responding all too loudly.
"Was expecting me? What are you talking about? I was told to come to this place at this time to give him back his coat, and now he's not here? Maybe I should have just kept the darn thing."
"Sir, I think you misunderstood,"
the receptionist replied.
"I said was because you've already met him,"
she whispered. She pointed back toward the elevator door, at the older man Greg had just pushed aside. Frozen in shame, his eyes bugged slightly as he gave the receptionist a what-do-I-do-now expression. Jonathan Buckland saved him from this incredibly uncomfortable moment with, "I thought you were on your way to a fire, young man. I was just coming over to greet the man who had enough integrity to return my favorite jacket." Realizing his faux pas and feeling a twinge of guilt at Buckland's use of the word integrity, Greg's demeanor immediately changed. After seeing his picture in magazines all these years, he couldn't believe he had failed to recognize the renowned Mr. Buckland. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, he was a giant of a man with an even larger personality. It would be hard for anyone to brush past such an iconic figure. Greg turned to greet the great Buckland, whose smile now peeked from beneath his famed bushy mustache, which resembled walrus tusks. His unpretentious blue eyes contradicted the imperial image expected of such a man. When Buckland extended his hand, Greg handed him the bag. Accepting the item, Buckland said, "I appreciate that, but I was attempting to shake your hand."
"Oh,"
Greg replied, turning an even brighter shade of red.
"I apologize, Mr. Buckland. It seems I cannot do anything right today. I really need a break. I should probably just give up and start all over."
"Nonsense. Understand this. We all make our own breaks, and at the end of the day, we are exactly where we choose to be." The tycoon paused and pointed to the open door of his office. "You got a second?" Realizing he had just been invited into the office of this legendary businessman, Greg tried to erase his awkwardness with a joke of sorts.
"Yes, I think I can fit you in."
As they stepped into the most tastefully decorated business office he had ever seen, he could not help but notice the incredible view of the harbor through the windows. As he stepped into Buckland's personal world, Greg didn't realize that he was also stepping across the threshold into a whole new chapter of his own life. "Take a seat," offered the host. "You seem a bit uptight. Tell me what's on your mind." Greg took the chair closest to the large desk and started right in.
"Sorry about back there. I'm very embarrassed,"
he said in a humble tone.
"I was very excited to be here and obviously went a little over the top. I've been a bit overwhelmed lately and thought that maybe my luck had changed when I had the opportunity to meet with you. In fact, I have to confess I was hoping for a big break. Then I blew it with my behavior. I'm really sorry. My girlfriend just left me with no warning after 5 years, and I'm seriously thinking about quitting my business. I'm pretty much at my wit's end and ready to throw in the towel."
Then, somewhat sheepishly, Greg went on.
"I can't believe I just unloaded on you like this. Once again, I apologize."
He thought to himself, "You are such an idiot talking to Buckland this way, like he really cares about your problems." "No apology necessary. You haven't blown anything. I am a good listener, and it sounds like we were supposed to meet. You know the saying, there are no coincidences. I enjoy helping young people like you discover who they really are and what they really want. The fact that you returned my jacket is a very good sign, even if your reason was just to meet me." He gave Greg a subtle wink. "I have something that may help you." Buckland reached for a book on the shelf behind him and handed it to his visitor. "It's about success. It tells you never to quit 3 feet from gold."
"3 feet from what?"
Greg asked, accepting the book. Instantly, he recognized the title, Think and Grow Rich, even though he had never read it. Politely, he thumbed through the pages before attempting to hand it back to his host. Buckland smiled without moving to retrieve it. Greg kept his arm outstretched in an awkward stalemate before setting the book down on the desk. Sitting back in his overstuffed leather chair, Buckland said, I'm going to share